Doing it again. Here we go. Take two. Okay, ladies and gents, I am on take two. Apologies for the first one. I had a slight sound issue. You should now hopefully be able to hear me. So I'm just going to check that we've got sound and everything's working as it should be, because a second ago I definitely didn't have it working. But it should be all good now. Yes, I can hear myself. Good afternoon, everybody. If you can just do me a great favor and tell me you can confirm there is a video. This is the video. Perfect. You can hear me. Excellent. Let me turn that off. I'm not going to bring Mr. G just into the situation just yet, because the thing is, he's been stood here tapping his hands and his feet at me, demanding why it's not working. But he is stood right in front of me. He's about to get started. I do apologize. It was a sound issue. It was a very complicated issue. I had it set to headphones, not to speaker. So all this fantastic technology that I've put together for our studio. But anyway, we are here now. We're live. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over in 2 seconds to Officer G. And he's going to take us through today our live tour. The first, let me bring you up, Graham, so we can have a quick conversation. Find you. You can say something.
Hello, everybody.
You can say something else.
Oh.
You can keep talking. I'm just trying to get your levels right.
Just to get the sounds right.
There we go. Perfect.
We'll be starting off in a few minutes now. And
well, I think we're pretty much ready. I'm just apologizing to people because obviously I made a slight mistake with the sound and we got started late. Now people are now saying they can hear us, but they can't see the video. But actually what you're looking at, believe it or not, is the video. So I'm going to just, we're going to get started. I think I've talked too much. This is the first one we've done since June. June. So we're very excited to be back. There is picture, trust me, this is a background. We're going to bring it up for you now. We're very pleased to be back. We're very pleased to be doing this once again. This is going to be the first one we do in a new series that we're bringing forwards. The series is going to continue. I don't think we've got an end date on this specifically. It probably won't end when lockdown ends. We probably will keep going and going and going. We're going to come together with some format as we go through this in terms of how long each show will be, the subjects we pick up, but we are going to talk about Shrewsbury Prison and Shepton Mallet Prison, and that's probably a really good opportunity for me to pass over to Officer G. Where would you like to start today, sir? Shepton Mallet Prison or Shrewsbury Prison?
Well, we'll cover a little bit of both, but I'll probably start off at Shepton.
Shepton Mallet Prison. Okay, let me find then Shepton Mallet Prison. There we go. If you'd like to make your way, Officer G, to Shepton Mallet Prison.
Ladies and gentlemen, on screen, at last. Okay, welcome back to all those that have been watching us before at the beginning of the year. And hello to all those new people that are watching. We hope that you find it interesting. And hopefully as we go along, you'll have plenty of questions to ask about anything that you've always wanted to know about prisons, but we're too afraid to commit a crime to come and find out yourself. But we'll see how we go with that. I'm just going to start off probably with the recent history of Shepton Mallet and Shrewsbury. The reality is with Shepton Mallet and Shrewsbury, they closed them both in 2013. Relatively small establishments. Shepton Mallet, from 2001 up to the day it closed in 2013, was actually what they call a Stage 2 Category C lifers prison. The whole prisoners, every prisoner in there was actually life sentence prisoners. But they'd done some considerable time in previous establishments before they'd managed to get to the Stage 2 of their sentence. All single cell accommodation, and the population was only just a little bit under 200, so not a big establishment. One of the things I like to point out about life sentence prisons or life sentence prisoners is a lot of people think they probably are the really, really hard work if you're working in a prison. I've worked in a prison with life sentence prisoners many years ago, and generally I found that in high security or lifers prisons, the regimes are far more relaxed than they may be in a place like a local prison. And some of the reasons for that, first of all, is that prisoners are serving a long time. They're much more established in the routines of the prison. They get to know staff, staff get to know them, and there aren't the great deal of turnovers that you see in local prisons, where you may have thousands and thousands of prisoners turning over in a local prison on remand, short sentences and such like. In lifers prisons, it's a very stable population, so their movements would be few and far between. And that was from 2001 up till literally 2013. Now, a lot of people ask the question, why do they close? Well, we closed 7 prisons in actual fact at the same time. And why do they close those smaller prisons? And the reality is they closed them probably more out of costs, because Shepton Mallet, particularly in 2010, was given an absolutely first-class report from the bodies that do the reporting on prison standards. However, 3 years later, they decided to close the prison. Shrewsbury as well had an excellent report about 2010, 2011, and they closed Shrewsbury. So they closed these smaller establishments purely, that's a personal opinion, of course, that they were about cost. They do cost more to run, but by their nature of being smaller, they generally run relatively much better than perhaps big establishments do. And that may be down to officers and prisoners in small establishments getting to know each other, set routines, and being able to manage prisoners. There's a lot more continuity that may go on in a smaller prison.
And I know we spoke about this previously when we were doing the lives, but I saw an article the other day that was talking about the new prisons that are being built, and the cost is between £58,000 and £62,000 per year per prisoner, whereas I believe Shrewsbury, when it closed, was running somewhere in the region of about £78,000 per prisoner per year. So it is obviously more money to house prisoners of Victorian jails. Obviously, there's a modernisation, but I think you touched on it previously, and I'm sure you're about to now, is about how well you know your prisoners with a smaller population. Shepton was 178 when it closed, I believe, 180. Shrewsbury was 340. So much smaller populations, you get, well, I would assume less reoffending, more rehabilitation work.
Well, yeah, there's an old saying said by Oscar Wilde, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. And the reality is, if you think about Shrewsbury and Shepton Mallet, these places only cost in the number of thousands to build when they were originally built. Yes, they do have a slightly higher upkeep because of having to put modernisation into some of these older establishments, and their heating bills might be relatively higher and all that. But over the lifespan of a prison, which can run for 100 to 150 years, that's a relative cost. I know the places like Wrexham Prison, HMP Berwyn, I think it cost upwards of £230 million to build. The question is, will it still be standing in 150 years' time? And as I said before, like large establishments, I've worked in large establishments. For anybody that may be looking that goes, well, you've never worked in a large one. I've worked on different wings, sometimes 3 or 4 different wings in the space of a 12-hour shift. And you don't really ever get to settle in that place that you're in, where you can start to actually get some kind of routine and establish things going on and get to know prisoners, and they get to know you, as I said before. And I think that makes a big difference. But that's sort of Shepton Mallet up to 2001. In actual fact, from 1966 up until 2001, it was basically a prison that was reopened. And that was basically to house prisoners that were on protection. It was the first prison in the country that was actually housed solely for its reason of holding what they call protected prisoners, those that cannot live for whatever reason with the general population. However, there were a number of other prisoners in there. They were very often what they call first-time prisoners, or prisoners that were at the very relatively low risk, where they weren't considered to be causing huge amounts of problems. So they were in a sort of a mixed environment, and it ran successfully through that time from 1966 right the way up until 2001. Before that, you've got the prison that was run from 1945 up till 1966, and that was run as a military prison by the United Kingdom. During the war from 1942 to 1945, it was the United States that ran it as a military prison when they were over here during the war as the Allies. And then before that, from 1939 up till 1942, it was the UK's military prison. And it was actually closed from 1930 right the way up till 1939. So quite unusual really to leave a prison empty for 9 years, to do nothing with it, and then decide to take it out of mothballs and reopen it. But they certainly did. So that's sort of Shepton Mallet, really. I don't want to go much further back into history because we're doing this here, but we'd much rather see you in person, coming and actually having a look around the prison, being taken around by the tour guides that can give you a much, much better insight and views of the history of the prisons. But
forever the salesman, aren't you?
Always.
come visit us.
I'm only a salesman when I get to tell the truth.
I thought I'd put up the picture very quickly of Shepton from an aerial view, so you can see, and Officer G will just be able to point out for us the quad, if you will, the 4 buildings surrounding the exercise yard. So just point to those for us a second.
Well, you can see just there.
Yeah, that's B wing.
That's the sort of exercise yard. It's in the middle.
Yeah.
And the wings were built around it. And that was actually where the original prison was built. So the gatehouse, you can't quite see it there. It sits on the very front of the building, a tiny little gatehouse.
The new gatehouse sits at the back, but the original gatehouse, if you point right up to the top, and sorry, we're just working out our technology, so keep going. Yeah, perfect. That is the original gatehouse.
Might fall in there.
Yeah. And it was different areas, and we'll pick up more. We'll do a specific live on Shepton. But
so they said that was the sort of central where the prison used to be originally. Bearing in mind that in those days, prisoners were literally marched through the front door of a prison. There were no such things when they built that prison originally of sort of vehicle access for prisoners to come in vehicles. They were literally taken off and walked straight through the front door and into the holding cells, and then moved on to the proper accommodation at a later stage.
Yeah, and can I just pick up very quickly, because this is one thing I've spoken about a lot. I talk to people an awful lot about this when I talk about Shepton. I think it's one of the really special things about Shepton Mallet Prison. I know it's very close to the hearts, I would say, of a lot of the staff that work there. The building that's just by your waist, if you just point your left hand out for me, just to the left, that one there, well, you're just covering it. Yeah, that building there, which houses the kitchen on the ground floor, the chapel on the top floor, but in the middle is OBU, so the Offending Behavioural Unit, which is where the psychology team used to work, because Shepton was quite a specialised prison. There was only 2 prisons in the country that ran the lifer programs that prisoners needed to do to get to the next stage of Cat D.
Yeah.
So
it's an interesting point that, in actual fact, I was having a conversation on Facebook with a group of people. Some of them were ex-prison officers, some were current prison officers, and they were talking about 23-hour bang-up, and it is a word that seems to be bandied around rather a lot, about 23-hour bang-up. I joined the service in 1977. And I do not remember at any stage through that 38-year career where we had what they call 23-hour bang-up as part of a normal regime. When I worked in the Borstals, prisoners were expected to go to education and go out to work. They used to learn trades with the carpenters and the sparkies, or they used to work on the farms and the market gardens. They had other classroom sessions, practical and academic, of course. When I went off to places like Gloucester Prison, Shrewsbury Prison, we had workshops, even though we were local prisons holding remands. We had workshops where prisoners were able to go to work. There was training in the education department, and we run other courses, alcohol awareness and all those things. And it's always been that way. Prisoners have been out of their cells during their time. Admittedly, the evening was a time when prisoners were locked up much earlier than they have been in the recent past. They were locked up literally at about 5 o'clock at night, particularly in your local prisons. Prisoners were coming in, they were getting their evening meal and locked up from about 5 o'clock through to the next morning. However, when I was in Gartree Prison, and that's going right through for many years, right the way through the 80s as well, prisoners were out in the evening until 8 o'clock. And indeed, in places like Long Lartin Prison, which is down in Evesham, same kind of dispersal prison, prisoners were out till 9 o'clock, and that's way back in the 80s. Out in the daytime, going to work and education, out in the evening. So I always take a little bit of issue when people say, oh, 23-hour bang-up and all that. It didn't really exist. However, when I worked at this prison, local prison, there have been prisoners that can refuse to work. Remand prisoners cannot be forced to work because technically or legally they're innocent until proven guilty. If they refuse to work, that's their entitlement. However, because we don't have staff or facilities to have prisoners wandering around the prison during the daytime, if they refuse to work, they have to spend that time in their cells. Convicted prisoners are required to work. It's part and parcel of the sentencing process. Yeah.
Can I just, somebody's just jumped in and asked, Vivian's asked, which is older, Shepton Mallet Prison or Shrewsbury Prison?
Shepton Mallet prison is older by far.
By far. Yeah.
By far. The original prison was built way back in the early 1600s.
Step to this side for me, Officer G, and I'll be able to... There we go.
Over the original.
There we go.
That's right. Right. Should have filmed this in a mirror, I said before. Yeah, that was built literally in the early 1600s. And over the years through the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, it was basically updated. And it's even had additional buildings put in the 50s, 60s and 70s, of course.
There's the new gate. So that's the opposite end of Shepton. So yeah. the image I had, sorry, a second ago was, I've just lost it.
And that would have been built a long time ago, because it's been a long time now that vehicles have been bringing prisoners into their prisons, of course. Now, Shrewsbury, its original prison that was sitting here was in the 1790s. It was actually a Georgian building, of which you can see there on the photograph. That's actually a Georgian building. It's still part of the original 1790s building. And the little figurine that you can see just up there is of a man called John Howard. John Howard was one of those great reformers from the 1700s. However, when he commissioned this prison, he never actually lived long enough to see it being completed in the 1790s. Inside the prison, it's mostly been updated to Victorian days. So in the 1890s, they literally knocked down virtually all the inside and rebuilt it by Victorian standards. And we've added more buildings since. There's been building added in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. As time moves on and you need to modernize, obviously we need to sort of add more buildings to it. So yeah, so Shepton Mallet by far. In actual fact, until it closed for quite a few years, it was actually the oldest operating prison in the country. However, that only came about because Lancaster Castle Prison closed some years before it. Now, Lancaster Castle was just that. It was a castle originally, and then it was taken over and converted into mostly part of a prison. Part of it's still open at this moment in time as a tourist attraction. It's actually closed as a prison because the Crown Courts are still connected to the side of it, and I believe they're still running.
We don't run that one though, so it's not.
No, we don't. No, we don't.
Not one of ours, but we do talk about other places. We do talk about other attractions because
it's a prison and it's the oldest. It was the original oldest.
Absolutely, and we love to share dark
excluding
stories.
the Tower of London, of course.
Yes,
even Reggie Cray and Ronnie Cray were locked up in the Tower of London originally. This is when they were in the forces. They absconded, AWOL'd, they got arrested, ended up there, and they also then ended up going to Shepton Mallet, where they spent some of the time when it was a military prison.
They did, and you know what, it's interesting you brought that up. You've done that almost on cue, as if you could read the comments yourself, because somebody was just asking about Reggie and Ronnie Cray.
I can't read the comments.
They asked if, firstly, if you'd ever worked with either of them, but I'm guessing banged up either of them is probably more appropriate. But also, if they were in either prison, and they were, as you just said, at Shepton Mallet Prison.
Yes, they were. My sort of meeting with Reggie Cray was actually when I was in Gartree Prison. He was there. He'd sort of nearly 19, 20 years into his life sentence at the time that I bumped into him. And he was at Gartree there in the mid 80s. But Ronnie I've never met, because Ronnie, I think, was sent to Broadmoor many years before, which is a psychiatric hospital, of course. No, really, it's quite strange, really, because I'd seen all the films about representing the Reggie Crays and the Ronnie Crays and the Cray, and many of us have seen those films where they've been portrayed on TV. And you always get the impression that these guys are great big 6-foot-plussers and got big muscle and a lot of power and all that. The reality is, I know that Reggie was only 5'7.5", which made me feel wonderful because I'm 5'8". You've got to take little victories while you can. But no, it's sort of an illusion that we always sort of represent those kind of characters on TV as these big brutes of men, and that's not strictly true physically. Don't get me wrong, they were what they were, of course. But I'm just talking about the physical things that surprise you when you see people in the real flesh. Yeah, and never a problem. He was already 20 years into his life sentence. You have to appreciate when you've got that much time under your belt, you basically become quite conditioned to prison life, to prison routines. And he got a 30-year tariff date, but he actually served 32. So he got knocked back on his original 30-year tariff date. But in that process of time, I think it was stomach cancer he got, I'm not quite sure. He was released some weeks before he died, and that was on order of the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary at the time. I don't know who, I can't remember who that was.
It's quite interesting because had he lived longer, although it would have had to been a lot longer, and had Shepton stayed open, or even not stayed open, he may actually have ended up back at Shepton because it was a lifers unit for people on tariffs, and that would have been, well, I guess, a real journey for him, a circular journey, because he started his first prison term at Shepton Mallet prison with his brother, and that's where they met Charlie Richardson. That's where the London gang wars began, and he almost could have ended up back there afterwards as well.
Well, the thing about life sentence prisoners is if they start off and go to what they call life sentence prisoners, unless they're the really high security, which are few and far between, they'll be in category A. They'll be in, I think it's one of 9 high security prisons, and they're known as category A prisoners, and which Reggie Cray was one of at the time, of course. But over the time, they may lose that category A status or have it sort of not put onto that, drop down a level and come down to category B status. And then in time, there's an expectation with probably the vast majority of life sentence prisoners, they're going to work their way through the system from category B down to category C, possibly category second stagers, those that are coming closer to their tariff dates and may have some expectation of seeing their tariff date or not soon after being released on parole. Just to clear that up, when prisoners get a life sentence, it's basically that, it's a life sentence. The only difference is judges put tariff dates on that sentence, and it may be for some people 15 years, it may be 20, 30, 35, and then when it comes towards that parole date or that tariff date, the parole board will decide whether they think it's suitable for that prisoner to be released. At that time, it may not be. They may leave it for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 years. If they do get released on parole, of course, they'll be on what they call a life license, and they'll be on the life license for the rest of their lives. So any breach of that license, regardless of whether they've committed another crime or not, may result in them being returned to prison. Yeah, life sentences are life sentences. There are currently, and it does fluctuate and change because people come into the system and people leave. I believe it's 76 prisoners that are on what they call a whole life tariff. In other words, the judge has given no minimum term to serve, and basically they are expected to be serving their whole life in a prison and will not be released.
I'm just going to do a nice little plug on that, because you're absolutely right. I think that number's correct, because we have put together a blog. Well, we've got a blog effectively, but we have put together details and information on every single one of those lifer prisoners, which we share through our website, through the newsfeed. So you can actually read up about these prisoners, what their crime was, how long they're incarcerated for, where they are now, so on and so forth. Before we move on, though, I just want to...
Can I just clear up one little point, because I think people might find this interesting. A few years ago, we had that horrendous a terrorist act in Manchester, where 22 people lost their lives. And a few years ago, they arrested the brother of the suicide bomber, and he's just recently been charged, found guilty of these terrorist offences as well, and he was given a life sentence. However, a judge cannot give a person under the age of 21 a whole life tariff, so they cannot say you're never to be released. But that may be why that judge actually gave that prisoner a 55-year tariff date. So he will not be legible for parole until he's served 55 years. And even then, because it depends on risk and all many factors, he may not be released at that point in time. So they won't even consider him for a parole until he's well into his 55th year. In other words, he's going to be in his 70s, mid to late 70s when he gets to that stage. So people always get a little bit confused, I read on different media processes. It cannot be given, the whole life tariff cannot be given to anyone under the age of 21.
Too many people reading The Sun, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, the government may, somebody said the government were looking at the possibility of reducing that age to 18 years old, because technically in society, 18, you're an adult. However, in prisons, you're not. In prisons, they never change that rule. If you're under 21, you're classified as a young offender in the British prison system.
But is it true, or am I making this one up, that if you are under 21, so potentially you're in a young offenders unit, but you are potentially a bully and you're quite difficult and you do throw your weight around, for want of a better word, that the prison service can turn and say, okay, well, we'll move you to a full prison if this is how you're going to behave, and they will move them slightly younger into a full prison?
Yeah, I'm not fully aware whether that still happens. I expect it does. I've not heard of anything different. However, I do remember a time here at Shrewsbury where we had a young offender that came down from a prison, a young offender's place in Stokeheath, and he committed an awful crime against another young offender by literally setting a light to them, setting them on fire, and did a huge amount of damage. That person didn't die, but I imagine they're living with lifetime of injuries. And because they said he was relatively unmanageable and dangerous with in the young offender establishment, they sent him down to Shrewsbury, where we had him basically, and we had him on relatively what they call normal location. That was to hopefully think to get that young offender. It was about, I think it was about 18 at the time. They might settle and be less problems in an adult prison, because adult prisoners perhaps may not be, I don't know, perhaps so quick to violence, but I can be left to be disproven on that by people that may have personal experiences of that. I do know that prisons are, the assaults in prisons on prisoners, prisoner on prisoner, and prisoners on staff is much, much higher than it's been in its history. Much higher. It's truly a problem.
I was going to say that's obviously a problem, but that's got to be. And again, well, actually, no, I am going to put you on the spot because I like putting you under a little bit of pressure. Is that's got to be with almost young offenders coming into, let's call it big prison, into full grown up prison. There's got to be an element of you can go from being the big fish in a small pond to suddenly being quite a small fish in quite a big pond. Yeah. And that is going to almost certainly change your behaviour.
Yeah, and remember that perhaps they chose a place like Shrewsbury because Shrewsbury did have a very good regime running, and there was very little problems. Yes, we have problems. We're a prison after all, but by many comparisons, Shrewsbury was a well-run and a safe prison for prisoners and a safe prison for staff. And remember, that's my perception of Shrewsbury. However, there have been cases where there have been prisoners have assaulted each other, and there have been cases where staff have been assaulted. But by many prison standards, very much down at the very lower level. So it may have been perhaps a smaller prison, better staff contact with that particular prisoner, because we were going to have to keep an eye on him, and you know, keep a pretty close eye on his behaviour and actions and stuff like that. But,
speaking of safety, you touched on it earlier. I don't want to jump in and interrupt. So we were talking about the oldest prison being Shepton and the castle and such. One of the interesting things that I find fascinating about Shepton and is so, I think, interesting to go and look at is the height of the walls. And I was down at Bodmin the other week. So just before lockdown, I went down to Bodmin jail with the site manager of Shrewsbury, Charlie. And we went and had a look around Bodmin and saw what they'd done with their tour and their new experience. And they're actually building a hotel at the moment. So they've got a big chunk of their wall missing. And we were looking at it and we were sort of debating about how high the wall was, whether it was as high as Shepton's or not. And we got chatting to the builders and we made some estimations. And the wall at Bodmin is 69 foot high. So it's a high wall. I think it's the second highest in the country, just behind Shepton Mallet, which comes in at 75 foot at its highest point, which is an incredibly high prison wall.
It is.
Bearing in mind Shrewsbury, I'll just throw it up here. Shrewsbury must be 25, 30 foot.
It'd be 25
at the lowest points.
At a push. It depends on the establishment you're in and how you build your walls, because they can all, remember in the Victorian times, they just basically put a wall up. Remember, prisoners in those days would have been spending most of their time in a cell or sitting outside their cell sewing or on the treadmills or the cranking system way back. So they weren't going anywhere outside the main wings, to be honest with you. But no, Shrewsbury's walls are not. And many prisons are roughly about the same height. Some are higher. Some are lower. Obviously, high security prisons, I don't want to go into the details of that. Their structure of their walls and the way that they build their security on those are completely different than anything that you'd see in a standard prison.
Yeah, because I find it, again, I love wandering around the jails, as you know, and having a look at the differences. It's not so much the low walls at Shrewsbury that's the problem, it's the vast amount of razor wire the other side. Whereas at Shepton, they don't have razor wire across the high parts of the walls. No. I'm going with the assumption is because nobody's going to scale
get that high. No. No. I remember over the days when they built places like Shepton at 75, they didn't have things like cameras. They didn't have things like patrol dogs. So the reality is these days when you've got cameras and geophonic fences and you've got all kinds of other security measures in and around your prison, then high walls may not be the biggest criteria that you need.
No, absolutely. And I know with Shepton, I'm showing Shrewsbury at the moment. I haven't got the image of Shepton, so I'll grab that for the next time we do it live. But the one thing with Shepton is the walls are the outside of the prison wing. So the high walls are literally the entire prison wing. So when you look at this,
well,
this is
oddly enough,
wall.
something I know you're aware of that. Where you see that green patch just there, which is the exercise yard.
Yeah.
Right. Originally, there used to be a gymnasium there, and that gymnasium was a flat roof. And that flat roof came to exactly the same height as the outer wall, which is just literally this side, or that side. Let's get there. That side. That side. Flat screens. 2D doesn't work, guys. You know it doesn't. But yeah, and there were some concerns there that obviously you could breach that gap because it was level. However, they might have done that. So they did raise that part of the wall, so you can actually see as you walk around the wall of prison, there's what they call another pitch, probably about another 3 to 4 foot higher. So they just made the pitch look further up to make it more difficult. So they put that slight extension on it. Yeah.
Well, it also stops people from throwing things over, because again at Shrewsbury, you're next to the outside wall on that green exercise yard, aren't you? So things could be thrown over. Whereas at Shepton Mallet, if I bring the picture back up, the chances of getting over something over the wall, you're just stand that way for us, Officer G.
Yeah.
Mind you, just go that way slightly.
The thing with that is when you look at that square yard there, like you said, it's quite a long way from the outer wall. So it is, pretty adventurous. However, it would not stop drones getting into that point in time, unless it was netted across the top, which our exercise yard was, of course, and fenced in.
But Shepton's wasn't. Shepton's was open, as it is.
Yes. Yeah. It sort of, sometimes it depends on the category of the jail. That depends the amount of sort of security you're going to build into the system, to be honest with you. But
okay, I'm just going to pick up. I'm conscious. We've got about sort of 5-10 minutes left, and I wanted to get your thoughts really and your feelings on what it was like when the prison closed. But before we do that, somebody has just asked a really good question about were prisoners allowed to wear watches if they wanted to, or were they deemed a weapon?
No watches in prison. They were allowed at some stage sometime before, but I've worked in a number of prisons where they limited the value of the watch that could come in onto the landings. Basically, if you'd got a watch that was possibly about £30 worth or less, it wasn't the end of the world, because it's not going to have a great deal of value. You have to remember expensive watches and jewelry is taken off prisoners, because expensive jewelry, it may be a source of currency. And if you don't want to use it as a source of currency, there may be other prisoners that see it and see the value in it, and they'll want it off you one way or the other. So no. And remember, many modern watches today are basically internet-based watches. So you have to be very careful about those kind of watches coming through the door, because they've got access to the internet and all kinds of other stuff. So they limit them, to be honest with you.
Okay, now, again, I've obviously heard this. We've discussed this many times. I know it's quite an emotive subject for you, but what was it like when you found out the prisons were going to close? What was that for officers? They obviously worked here for a while, for prisoners as well. What was the impact for them? Because they're effectively being evicted, aren't they?
Well, we had very little notice. I think people might think that you're told about 12 months before that you're going to be closing, so get yourself ready and look for where else you might to be or what else. The reality is, I think it was announced on the 10th of January. We were officially told on the 20th, and we were all out of the prison by probably about the 1st of March. The prison officially closed at the end of March, 31st of March. But most of the prisoners and most of the staff had gone by about this first week into March. So the reality is, staff were, hugely disappointed. This was a prison, like you said, that ran well. Everybody worked well together. That was between officers and managers and the healthcare and the education department. We all worked as one good, solid team, works department, everyone. So we were wholly disappointed. One of the reasons I stopped at this prison so long is 25 years, because who'd want to leave a prison that's running well? There was a huge amount of disappointment when they closed prison. We did everything that was required of us as a prison. It was a safe prison. We were running the programs. We were doing all the things that were required of us. There are terminologies in the system. You'll find them in education: KPTs and KPIs, key performance targets, key performance indicators. We hit all those, and yet they still closed us. And that's why I say it's cost.
Yeah, as did Shepton. I know Shepton was
very much. They were all might be the same. Small prisons generally. Gloucester was a good small prison to be in as well.
It was. I think that the challenge there with Gloucester, because it had a young offenders wing, didn't it? The officers there used to say to us quite regularly, they just didn't have enough space for these young lads to get out and exercise and get rid of the testosterone. They just used to fight, and they'd be breaking up fights 3-4 times a day.
Now, don't get me wrong. Staff that work in large prisons, you've got your Manchester, your Liverpool, your Leeds, and you've got your London large prisons with 1,500-1,600 prisons. I have no illusion those staff work very, very, very hard to keep some kind of balance in a prison. Remember, their job at a basic level is to manage prisoners. And some of those are extremely difficult. Some of those are extremely dangerous. And there are others that can't cope in prison, can't cope at all. The very high levels of self-harming is going on in prison. The level of attempted suicides and suicides are much higher. The assaults, the drug addiction, all those things, the gang elements in prisons is growing. So large prisons that, certainly they have my respect because I've worked in them before myself, and they can be very, very hard places. And they work extremely hard to keep these places on an even keel.
I'm going to pick up on, I think, one last question before we finish today, and then we'll set up ready for next week's, and we'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to bring up a picture of a cell very quickly. It's actually a bit of a battered cell, that one. And somebody has asked a random question: do they have mirrors in cells?
Yes, but they're metal mirrors, basically like an aluminium piece laid under a piece of plastic. Perhaps today they give them glass. I'd like to think they didn't. And it depends on the establishment you're in. Remember, you've got different classifications, your category A's, your cat B's, your cat C's. You've got open prisons. I'm not quite sure about open prisons, but because they're such low risk, they might go, having a mirror is the least of those issues for prisoners at that low risk level. But no, in Shrewsbury, we used to shout a little square thing. It was very much like a tile, a kitchen tile, a square 6-inch kitchen tile. Yeah. And it was basically metal, shiny metal. And that was what they used to have.
Yeah, and we've got those at both of the prisons. If you visit Shepton Mallet prison or Shrewsbury prison, you'll be able to go inside the cells. We've got cells that are fully dressed as they were when the prisons closed in 2013. Cells dressed all the way back to Victorian and Georgian times. I'll show you some now. There's a Victorian cell. There's a Georgian cell, another Victorian cell. So we've got these areas you can go and have a look at.
You've got your ex-wife, got my ex-wife on there. I hope you're not watching this, Margaret.
Oh, brilliant. I've lost my train of thought. So yes, we do have cells that you can go into, and you can have a look at things like the mirrors stuck on the walls. And there you can also see, just on the side, there's a pot noodle pot with toothbrush and toothpaste and razors and all those kind of stuff.
Yeah, prisoners are entitled to spend X amount of money per week, and they'll buy things like tins of tuna and your pot noodles and your crisps and your sweets and your chocolate and tins of this and tins and that. Yeah, they are entitled to buy those things on a weekly basis. There's a limit to how much they can spend, of course, but yeah, some save it up. And I've been in cells sometimes and it looks like a corner shop. Honestly, there's that much. There's a danger with that because it shouldn't be. Technically, you need to stop it when you can, because what you've got is somebody on running a secondary business. Yeah, they're buying in the stuff at whatever the prison's selling it at and then pushing it back out again at a higher price. And then you get things like debt ticking in, and then.
Well, look, let's pick that up on another day, because, like I say, we've done just under 45 minutes today because there was a slight delay in us getting started.
Yeah, I don't know why that is.
I'm really regretting, because just before we went live, guys, you won't have seen it, but we've got Harriet, our sales and marketing director, sat over in the corner waving frantically in case she thinks that Graham or I are going to swear, and things like that. So she's policing us over there. It's just the three of us in quite a large room, so we obviously can keep social distancing. But just before we started, I said very confidently, didn't I? I announced, how much do we want to bet that I've got everything right, everything tested, sound, picture, everything's going to work absolutely fine. You actually didn't throw any money against this one, which I was surprised at. Obviously went live and we had no sound.
No, so there you go. Yeah. And to show you how far we are social distance from each other, just before we leave, I'll let you see, I'm actually shooting this from not an actual side of the prison at all. There you go, guys. That's the way to be socially isolated. So hopefully I've got to be confined to there for the next month or two.
Out of the Bahamas.
Yeah. Not a soul. Look at that.
Well, what we are going to do, ladies and gents, we're going to bring our lives back. I think we're going to bring them back weekly. Well, we will be bringing them back weekly. We're going to probably try and do them based between a Shepton Mallet prison and a Shrewsbury prison, because we run both. We're going to do them virtually like this, so you'll be able to see what's going on. We'll be able to show you different aspects. We'll be able to pick up different subjects each week, but we will go live on both channels at the same time, and we'll do our utmost to be able to talk about Shepton Mallet prison and Shrewsbury prison, and kind of split the hour that we're going to be live for in half, really. And I think what we'll probably do in the next couple of weeks is we'll get one of the team from Shepton Mallet prison involved as well. We'll get them in on the phone, and we can obviously have a conversation with them about certain things that they do down there. But yeah, if you have any questions, anything that you'd like us to cover on the next lives, do let us know. We'll prepare it beforehand, and then obviously we'll go forwards. And I don't know, Harriet, if we have a specified time frame that we want to do, or a time that we want to do, whether we want to do the daytimes like we used to at 11 o'clock in the morning, whether we want to do a 3:30, whether we want to do early evening, if there's a preference.
11 o'clock was popular, but we were thinking about the school run.
Well, school, yeah, I was going to say lockdown's a
Get
bit
some feedback,
different.
see what it says.
Yeah, so people, if you guys would like to let us know what your preference would be in timing, we'll obviously do that. Personally, I'm just used to clicking a button and things being on demand. But let us know what times you'd like, and obviously we will try and feed everything into that and do as much as we can. Anything you'd like to leave us with, Officer
All
Jim?
I've got to say is stay safe, everyone. Stay safe. Let's get through this, and hopefully soon next year we can get back to running the prison and getting everybody in to have a good look around the place.
Excellent. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see you next week.